This is Unsung History, the podcast where we discuss people and events in American history that haven't always received a lot of attention. I'm your host, Kelly Therese Pollock. I'll start each episode with a brief introduction to the topic, and then talk to someone who knows a lot more than I do. Be sure to subscribe to Unsung History on your favorite podcasting app so you never miss an episode. And please, tell your friends, family, neighbors, colleagues, maybe even strangers to listen to. This week, we're discussing Anna Rosenberg, the civilian woman who became the Assistant Secretary of Defense in 1950, whom the New York Times, upon her death, called, quote, one of the most influential women in the country's public affairs for a quarter of a century, unquote. Anna Marie Lederer was born in Budapest, Hungary, on July 19th, 1899, though some sources say her birth year was 1901 or 1902. After a failed business deal, her father emigrated to New York in 1910, and his wife and daughters followed in 1912. Anna was naturalized in 1919. Her first appearance in the New York Times was during high school, when she gave a well-received speech during a meeting of students who opposed mandatory military training, an early foray for her into mediation. At age 21, she married Julius Rosenberg and gave birth to their son, Thomas. In the 1920s, Anna Rosenberg worked as a labor mediator, opening her own public relations firm that specialized in labor issues in New York City in 1924. At the same time, she was immersing herself in Democratic political campaigns, mentored by activist Belle Moskowitz and Tammany leader Jim Hagan. Rosenberg's work on Franklin Roosevelt's gubernatorial campaign in 1928 brought her to the attention of Eleanor Roosevelt, who would continue to champion her career. After Roosevelt was elected president in 1932 and began to implement New Deal programs, Rosenberg served as assistant to Regional Director of the National Recovery Administration, Nathan Strauss, and then succeeded him in the position, becoming the only woman to serve as Regional Director of the NRA, which she followed by becoming the first woman to serve as a regional manager for the Social Security Board. In the early 1940s, Roosevelt brought Rosenberg to D.C. to help with various crises, calling her his Mrs. Fix-It. In one such instance, he sent Anna to deal with a labor crisis in Buffalo that could have derailed defense production. The solution she devised became known as the Buffalo Plan and served as a national model for the duration of World War II. In 1944, President Roosevelt asked Rosenberg to travel to Europe to assess the situation for soldiers on the ground and to see how the government could help them when they returned. She went, speaking with soldiers, asking them what they needed, and offering to pass messages to family when she returned. Based on her conversations, Rosenberg saw a need for educational opportunities for returning soldiers, and she supported the GI Bill. Upon returning to Europe the following year, again at the president's request, Anna saw a liberated concentration camp. She was one of the first women from an Allied country to do so. On October 29th, 1945, Anna Rosenberg was awarded the very first Medal of Freedom, which had just recently been authorized. She was recommended for the award by Dwight D. Eisenhower, then General of the Army, in recognition of her work in Europe. After the war, Rosenberg returned to New York, where she again did consulting work, now with her son as her partner. However much she wanted to return to private life, not least to rebuild her finances, she was called back into government service just a few years later, when Secretary of Defense George C. Marshall asked her to be the Assistant Secretary of Defense, at a time when the military was ill-prepared as the Korean War started. President Truman supported her nomination, but she faced opposition in the Senate from Senator Joe McCarthy, who investigated her and tried to tank her confirmation. I will discuss that in more detail with today's guest. McCarthy was unsuccessful in his attempt, and Anna Rosenberg was sworn in on November 29, 1950. In 1951, Rosenberg established the Defense Advisory Committee on Women in the Services, an all-women board that worked to find ways to make military service more appealing to women. Rosenberg also oversaw the integration of troops that had been mandated by President Truman's Executive Order 9981 in July 1948. Anna Rosenberg left the federal government at the end of Truman's presidency in 1953, though she continued to serve as an informal advisor to Presidents Eisenhower and Johnson appointed her to serve on the Commission on Income Maintenance. She didn't have as close a relationship with President Kennedy, though she did organize his 1962 birthday party, where Marilyn Monroe famously sang him happy birthday. In 1962, Anna and Julius divorced, and Anna remarried to Paul G. Hoffman, who had been administrator of the Economic Cooperation Administration, leading the implementation of the Marshall Plan. He was later the first administrator for the United Nations Development Program. The Medal of Freedom that Anna Rosenberg had been awarded was superseded by the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1963, and Paul Hoffman was granted that award in 1974 by President Richard Nixon. Rosenberg spent her later years working at her consulting firm, but she was often called back into public service. Selected to serve on the New York City Board of Hospitals, the Business Advisory Council of Governor of New York W. Averell Harriman, the National Heart Committee, and the New York City Board of Education, among many other boards and councils. Anna Rosenberg Hoffman died on May 9, 1983, after suffering from cancer. Joining me now to help us learn more about Anna Rosenberg is history teacher and writer Christopher C. Gorham, author of The Confidante, the untold story of the woman who helped win World War II and shape modern America. Hi, Christopher. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Kelly, glad to be here.
So I was just fascinated to learn about Anna Rosenberg. I will admit I had never heard of her before, which seems shocking in retrospect. I want to hear a little bit about how you became interested in her and decided to write a book about her.
Sure. I'm a high school history teacher in suburban Boston. And about 6 years ago, I was up in the school library with my class, and I had opened a book. It might have been on Truman. It might have been on the Korean War. I don't remember. But in that book, there was a picture of President Truman, a big smile on his face. And next to him was a obviously civilian woman, well-dressed, a big smile on her face. And the caption at the bottom said, Anna Rosenberg, Assistant Secretary of Defense. And I thought, wow, 1950 to have a woman at that high in the Pentagon. And she obviously has a good relationship with the president of the United States from this picture. So I thought to myself, wow, who is this person? Let's learn more. So I put Anna Rosenberg's name on my list of research topics for my students, and a couple of kids chose her, and immediately, within a couple of days said, Mr. Gorham, there's no books on her. So we found out that her papers had been left at Harvard in 1987. So my wife and I, in April of 2019, met these students down at the library at Harvard, and they wheeled out the documents and gave us the gloves. And about 30 seconds later, one of my students said, Mr. Gorham, you have to come look at this. And in the first box that we opened up, there was the citation from President Truman awarding Anna Rosenberg the first ever Medal of Freedom, man or woman, in American history. And Kelly, I thought right then and there, this is a book that has to be written.
Yeah, absolutely. So the next obvious question is, why in the world have so few of us ever heard of her? She's an amazing, accomplished woman. I thought I knew a lot about important women in American history, and I had never heard of her. So why is that?
I think there are a number of reasons, and I think for your listeners, just to set a little context, she was a famous person in her day. Anna Rosenberg was on the cover and in the pages of Time dozens of times, Newsweek, Life, the Saturday Evening Post, magazines that we no longer have. I mean, she was in the New York Times for the first time as a teenager in 1917, and for the last time, her obituary in 1983. And in the ensuing decade, she was in the New York Times. So she was a famous person. She was on the radio. She was in the early 50s on television. The question is, what happened? And I think there's multiple reasons for that. The one reason would be by her nature, she didn't want to trumpet her own career. She liked to have interviews with newspaper journalists. She liked to have her photograph taken for the magazines. I mean, she was in Vogue at one point in 1942, but it was never about her. It was always about the president, or it was about the war effort, or it was about women in the war effort. And so she had this natural disinclination to trumpet her own career. I think that was also exacerbated by the fact that in 1950, the atomic spies, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, were arrested. So she had this unfortunate coincidence of surname. Rosenbergs around the country were shunned, and they had no relation at all to Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. And although Anna, I don't ever think was ashamed of her last name, it certainly, if she had this disinclination to trumpet her own career, then I think this certainly almost silenced her a little bit. And lastly, she didn't have a college education like Frances Perkins, who could say Penn and Columbia and keep the fire alive of her memory. But lastly, Kelly, I think it was, Anna Rosenberg had been told in 150 meetings with Franklin Roosevelt one-on-one, which is more than most cabinet members, had been told things in confidence. And she did not think that publishing a memoir, publishing a book, she just found that distasteful. She had been told these things in confidence, and she wanted to keep it that way.
So this is a difficult world for a woman to enter in the 30s, 40s, 50s, to be such a high-ranking official in some cases, or a private confidant of presidents in other cases. And she manages to do this with both obvious competence and charisma and all of that, but also doesn't shy away from being a woman, is still very feminine. Could you talk a little bit about that balance? Because it seems really striking that she's able to do this.
Glad you asked that question, because it's kind of at the heart of what the sort of magic recipe was for Anna Rosenberg. She was one scholar who'd written a paper on her, titled it Honorary Man. And this particular scholar, Anna Caston Nelson, was a sort of her angle at Anna was military history and her work at the Pentagon. But she could be, in the book, I think I used the phrase, she could be one of the boys and one of the girls. Sometimes women that attain a high rank kind of pull up the ladder, and they say, I've reached the big boys table, and I'm good. And, if I have any followers, then good for them, but I'm not going to help them out. That was not her. She was very eager and really wanted women to follow in her footsteps. So for women did not hold it against her that she'd attained these positions. And for men, both on the left and the right of the political spectrum, they respected her for the competence, for sure. Roosevelt, at one point in the middle of World War II, started calling her his Mrs. Fix-It. So she had this competence in politics, this competence and confidence in business, and later on in the military. But Anna, was also aware of the fact that she was a woman. And she said to Edward R. Murrow in an interview in 1959, she said, I like to dress nicely. I like to wear these fancy hats. And I don't feel I need to dress like a man. I just don't think that's what I or other women should have to do to be taken seriously in the rooms of power and in the halls of power. So just this kind of wonderful mix of competence and the ability to inspire confidence in people that relied on her without being who she wasn't. She was proud to be a woman and loved that had that pull over men and over people as well.
So one woman who did not get along with her is Frances Perkins. And Frances Perkins, of course, is one I have heard of, the first woman cabinet secretary. So could you talk a little bit about that relationship? Because as you said, it's not that Anna's shunning all other women. She's friends with Eleanor Roosevelt. Lady Bird Johnson likes her. But there is this particular tension with Frances Perkins.
There was tension. And I will... first of all, I venerate Frances Perkins. Her wish list became the New Deal, and you bow down. She's just a tremendous woman in American history, tremendous person in American history, first cabinet member. But I'm going to put the blame on President Roosevelt for this one, because he had a practice, which must have been tremendously annoying for the people that worked under him, of putting people on these parallel tracks. So he would have a Secretary of Labor, Frances Perkins, but he would also give what should have been under the umbrella of the Labor Department. He would give Anna Rosenberg these tasks, and then he would want her to go try and find solutions to them. He did this not only between the two women, Perkins and Anna Rosenberg. He did this as a sort of practice. That was a Rooseveltian thing that he did, is put people on these parallel lines where they had to compete against each other to make him happy, to make the boss happy. So I think that's part of it. Newspapers were in the 1940s would call Anna Rosenberg, the Secretary of Labor, a de facto Secretary of Labor. They would call her Frances Perkins number 2. And, that would be probably annoying to both women to be reading that. And the other, as I delve deeper into that relationship, Anna was always very deferential and very respectful to Secretary Perkins. Perkins was obviously a little bit older and more lettered. She had the degrees and she had the sort of the personal history that was very impressive. But they were very different people. In one instance, there were things that Roosevelt knew Anna could go out and do that he knew Perkins couldn't. And when it had to involve going up on the Hill and talking to congressmen, that was more Anna's wheelhouse, because she had the rap. She had the confidence to do that. When it came time to deal with the media, certainly Anna was better at that than Frances Perkins. So there was tension between the two, very different people. You have, I think I've alluded to it a little bit, but you have, the sort of waspy, Ivy League woman, and also, a Jewish immigrant who didn't graduate from high school. So very different people.
Yeah, definitely. I was struck reading your book about, I wonder how successful Anna Rosenberg would be today, because it seems like so much of her success was in I don't care about procedures. I'm just going to pick up the phone and do it. And there's proper chain of command. I don't care, and as someone who is working in America today, I know that so much of my job is you must do it this way, and there will be legal consequences if you don't do this. So, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about her style, which was clearly very effective, and what that looked like.
That's, I think, the first time that I've been asked that. It's something that I guess I've thought about, just me thinking about this, because as a teacher, obviously, even a high school teacher, there's obviously, there's just so many things that you have to T's you cross and I's you dot, and things you just have to be aware of in your practice. So very interesting question. I don't know that she would have been able to succeed in the world that we've developed. And maybe we should put the blame on the systems that we've erected, because we would have to insist for most people, for most people, we'd want to see the resume. And, can you imagine Anna Rosenberg, who never doesn't have a college education, let alone a law school education, a law degree, in charge of like the Social Security Board, where she has literally hundreds of lawyers working for her in dozens of field offices, and she's never cracked open a law book. So nevertheless, she had the talent to get that job done with tremendous competence. But in the world of today that we live in, I maybe we're snuffing out people with tremendous transcendent ability because of our demands, to look at the check off the boxes on somebody's resume and not seeing the big picture of who they are. So that's a great question. And I hate to say it, but I think that maybe today she wouldn't have been able to reach the levels that she had reached in the 30s, 40s, and 50s.
So I want to talk a little bit about her ability to walk into a labor negotiation and be respected by both sides. I think that's incredibly difficult to do. And I'm curious what your sense is about how she was able to do that the labor side liked her and respected her, but the management also liked her and respected her. How did she manage to do that?
I think in a similar way to how she reacted or how she was seen by men and women. Men and women respected her, which is very difficult to be a woman in such military and political and business echelons that she was in, to have the respect of, women and men that were on the Democratic side of the aisle and men that were on the Republican side of the aisle. And that leads right to your question about how she did it with labor and management. So the other sort of magic, secret sauce here is, and her grandson told me, her grandson Thomas, in interviews before the book, said that when she talked to you, you were the only person in the world. And his evidence was, one of the pieces of evidence was, when he was in boarding school as a 16 or 17-year-old, he would make 3 phone calls, collect phone calls. And for your listeners, the collect call was the recipient had to agree to pay for the phone call. He'd make 3 phone calls on Sunday nights from his boarding school, one to his mother, and they'd have a little conversation, one to his father, and they'd have a short conversation, and one to his grandmother, and they'd talk for 90 minutes. And it would be about how you're doing in school. And so she was able to do that for union men. One union guy way back in the 1920s, early 30s said, when Anna tells you something, she's on the level. And that was true of the unions that she worked with, whether they were garment unions or trucking unions or what have you, but also management. And, we're not talking about small concerns here. Anna Rosenberg was a mentor to Nelson Rockefeller. She was a mentor to, in fact, 2 of the Rockefeller brothers. Nelson Rockefeller, who went on to become the vice president of the United States, said everything he amounted to in Washington, he owed to Anna Rosenberg. And in his business life too, he consulted her. They wrote speeches together. They hammered out things together and solutions together. So you have not only the union guys, the truck drivers, the Teamsters, who respect her because she's obviously on their side. But at the very same time, you have managers saying, if I would have talked to her a little bit sooner, I would have saved myself $10,000. And how she did it is by, I think, just this sort of magic mediation where she was able to instill confidence in both sides, and just how few people can do that. Again, just that's why she's kind of superhuman in a way, to exist in this gray area, to succeed in this gray area where it's very difficult. So I think that personal ability, though, to look people in the eye and let them know that they're the only person in the world while she's talking to them. I think that's the magic.
So, people who are aware of the 50s in the United States may see where this is going, but she's Jewish, she's an immigrant, her last name is Rosenberg, she's a woman. Not surprisingly, Senator Joe McCarthy says, no. This is not someone we want. And especially when she is nominated to be the Assistant Secretary of Defense, to have this woman, immigrant woman, really high ranking in the Department of Defense. Can you talk a little bit about how McCarthy went after her? And, I think it's really interesting if you know anything about that era and what it was like for people even when they were exonerated. How did Anna Rosenberg survive this attack by McCarthy?
Here, I'll go back just a second here. She received a letter from the Secretary of Defense, George C. Marshall, who had been the architect of victory in World War II, just one of the giants of American history. He's been called the greatest soldier statesman since George Washington. So she gets this letter from him in 1950 in the disastrous early days of the Korean War. I want you to come down to the Pentagon and work as my number 2, Assistant Secretary of Defense, to rebuild the size and strength of the U.S. Army that had been decimated by budget cuts after World War II. So she goes down because she loves the general, she loves her country. She goes down to Washington, leaves a comfortable, she was rebuilding her business. She leaves that all behind in New York. She's working with her son. She goes down to Washington once again, and she starts working at the Pentagon under an interim appointment with the blessing of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Senator, as you pointed out, Kelly, Senator Joe McCarthy finds out about this. And although he's not on the committee, he buys time for the full Senate confirmation. He buys a delay so that he can conjure up a smear campaign, which had been so successful in the first couple of years of McCarthyism. He would target women. They were easy targets. If they were married to a foreigner, if they spoke with an accent, if they had a New Deal background or liberal leanings, he would just say, "Hey, you're a communist," and they would. A lot of them just left prematurely, left government service prematurely, or had their careers ended prematurely. That was not going to happen to Anna Rosenberg. McCarthy did get, in the 2 weeks where he'd bought himself, he found a guy in New York who would come down to Washington and testify that Anna Rosenberg was a secret communist. And this guy, checkered background, he goes down, and the Senate Armed Services Committee reopened the hearings, and this guy's story just started to unravel. Senator Lyndon Johnson said, how can you, after 20 years, how can you know for certain that this was the same person with the same voice, the same height, the same look? And when his ex-wife was called to the stand, she said he has a very difficult time for veracity. His employers were called to the stand, and they said this guy couldn't tell the truth if his life depended on it. So he was obviously a stooge, and his story unraveled. But, instead of just bowing down to the pressure, Anna Rosenberg knew she had the bullseye on her chest. She told the general, she told President Truman, I have all those things that you mentioned. Jewish immigrant, New Dealer, I'm a woman, I'm a civilian. And she fought back. She took a phone book down with her, a New York City phone book, down to the hearings, and she held it up and she said, do you know how many Anna Rosenbergs are in this phone book? 47. How do you know it was me? So by her nature, she fought back, she punched back, and she was really one of the first, maybe even the first person to put a welt on Joe McCarthy rather than that be the other way around. And to her credit, she withstood that with her career and integrity intact.
Probably helped that she had a lot of friends in high places too.
It sure did. That's a great point. When you think about how she withstood that smear campaign, she had Eisenhower on her side. She had Republicans on her side, not just Eisenhower, but, like I said, Rockefeller and others in the Senate and in Congress and in the business world. And you wonder if she didn't have those on the Republican side or those people in high places in support of her, you do wonder how that might have turned out differently.
You mentioned that before she got that letter from Marshall, she was trying to rebuild her business. So can we talk a little bit about that, the way that government service for her really meant a sacrifice, a real sacrifice?
It did. It started early on. It started with as she got ever closer to World War II, as World War II got ever closer, she became ever tighter with Franklin Roosevelt. So at one point, she's the executive of the Social Security Board in New York. It's 1938, but then you get closer to 1940-41, and Roosevelt gets her an office in the East Wing of the White House, and she's starting to work on what they called at the time manpower issues, but we would call those personnel issues related to the Army and so forth, and labor. The things that she was working on would be, for instance, we have these highly technical guys with a lot of know-how who are being drafted, and they need to be like naval architects or something like that. And they're being drafted as ensigns or they're being drafted as privates in the Army. We just can't have that. So that's in fact how she met George Marshall in World War II. But it was a sacrifice to go down to New York. She basically had to put her business, which was growing and growing. Her personal relations, labor relations business, where her mediation was sought after and paid for by big companies like Macy's and Encyclopedia Britannica. She had to put all that on ice during the war years. So much so that, it wasn't until after World War II that she was able to buy her apartment that she'd rented for decades. So it was a real sacrifice to go to Washington and work on behalf of the government. But it also speaks to her commitment that she learned way back when, as a young immigrant girl, when her father, who had also immigrated a couple of years before her, instilled in her the need to do whatever you can to help your country achieve what it can, to add your voice and to add your efforts to the United States. So that was she was a lifelong patriot, Kelly, and a lifelong, she was just devoted to Roosevelt, to Marshall, and to her country.
So I want to talk a little bit about how progressive she was. So it might not be a surprise we're talking about she's a New Dealer. She's working with FDR. She's obviously progressive, but she's even much more progressive than Roosevelt. She's looking out for women, especially as her career develops. She is really pushing for civil rights and integration. Can you talk a little bit about that and how she was able, despite the fact that she never held elected office, that she was really able to push some of these things through?
Yeah, the big one with civil rights goes back to, and hers was a lifelong commitment. It went back into the 1920s and forward into the Vietnam era. But the real big event that she was involved in terms of civil rights happened in the summer of 1941, just about 6 months before Pearl Harbor. The defense industries were already cranking out material and our ordnance and tanks and planes, and these were good paying jobs. They were only being given to white Americans. The black leader of the day, A. Philip Randolph, says to the White House, well, I'm going to march for equality. I'm going to have a march in Washington for equality and hiring. Roosevelt says, how many marchers? Randolph says, perhaps 100,000, Mr. President. Even Eleanor was okay with this. But for Roosevelt, he had, Southern lawmakers that he knew were not going to be on board with this. And it was just a real predicament. So he calls upon Anna and he says, I need you to mediate a solution between the White House and the black leadership. So over 2 weeks in the summer of 1941, Anna was at every single meeting. Roosevelt demanded that she was at every single meeting in New York and Washington. And what she hammered out after those 2 weeks became Executive Order 8802, which mandated fairness in defense hiring and actually had a watchdog provision. But Kelly, she still had to get the president to sign it. So Eleanor says to her, Anna, what I want you to do is go down to the boutiques of Georgetown, get yourself one of those fancy hats that you love, buy yourself a new one, get yourself the confidence to come back and get the boss to sign it. So that's what she did. She came back to the White House that afternoon, spread out the executive order on his desk and said, sign it, Mr. President, sign it. And he did. And as historian David Kennedy calls that the first significant federal action on civil rights since Reconstruction. But her commitment to Black equality and to equality for women was lifelong. I kept waiting in my research, Kelly, to find something where she took a wrong step, but it just never happened. The commitment was real and the commitment was consistent.
I want to talk a little bit about her work ethic because, people may get the sense from everything we're talking about that she was doing, that this all takes a lot of time, and she was doing a ton of commuting back and forth. And of course, there was no laptop with internet back then, so it's not like she could get everything done while she was on the train or whatever. Can you talk about how hard she was working? Like how much this is almost like superhuman?
Yes, I think I've used that word too, superhuman, to describe her work, her capacity for work. I'll give you just one example. It's at the Pentagon. She's, even from the interim appointment from the very first day, and she was at the Pentagon for 26 months. The full Senate came around, and she spent 26 months during the Korean War as the Assistant Secretary of Defense, made 2 trips to Korea, and in fact, bases around the world, like circumnavigated the globe practically. But at the Pentagon, she found out early on that they were using form letters to inform families of, either killed in action, missing in action, or wounded. And she said, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to write handwritten letters. So she and her staff started staying at work until, and when everyone left at 5, that was tea time in her office, which was also Marshall's office. The same, they literally had adjoining offices. They shared a coffee pot. And she would stay till 9, 10 o'clock. and sometimes even later, and then go back to the Shoreham Hotel and have a solitary dinner. And her staff, rather than resenting this, they loved her. They called her Aunt Anna because she was just so wonderful to work with and so forward looking. So they didn't resent the hard work. But she always had 3 phones on her desk. And, she would have her assistant would, Rockefeller's on line 1 and this other union leader, Dubinsky's on line 2 and, General or Admiral's on line 3. So the telephone really supplanted the pen for her and helped her be efficient with her time. She said, I issue no memos. I'm not going to have anything with 8 carbons. When I need something done, I hop on the telephone and I talk to a friend and I say, let's get a solution. Let's get it done. So that really helped her. And commuting, she had her files with her. She'd be working on the train. She'd be working as she was being driven from place to place. She didn't drive. So she always sat in the backseat and got work done. So, but he's superhuman, something that really, her work ethic really stands out and is another reason why she's such a remarkable figure.
Well, I have a million more questions I could ask, but I want people to just go read the book. So can you tell people how they can get a copy of the book?
Sure. Anywhere from the big places where you all know you can get the books to your wonderful local bookstores, of which there are many in Chicago and Boston, Philadelphia, and elsewhere. So there's an audio version, if that's your thing. There's a Kindle version, but the hard copy is widely available. So I've even seen it in many, many airports. So
it would be a good airplane read.
It would be. That's right. Right. So yes. So it's out there, and hopefully folks will go out there and pick it up.
Was there anything else you wanted to make sure we talk about?
I love your questions, and I love the question about what made her tick. The one about the sort of the respect between men and women and between people of modest backgrounds and also the very wealthy. And I think that, just to reiterate that's kind of what made her special. She was a unique human being because she would make everybody feel, and she meant it. She would be sincere about this. She would make you feel that you were the only person in the world. And I think that as a personal trait, that's just such a wonderful thing to have and to hone. And she had it to an amazing degree. And that's what made her a remarkable woman, a remarkable American.
Yeah. Well, Christopher, thank you so much for speaking with me and for introducing me to Anna Rosenberg.
Kelly, thank you for having me. Thanks to your listeners, too.
Thanks for listening to Unsung History. Please subscribe to Unsung History on your favorite podcasting app. You can find the sources used for this episode and a full episode transcript at unsunghistorypodcast.com. To the best of our knowledge, all audio and images used by Unsung History are in the public domain or are used with permission. You can find us on Twitter or Instagram at unsung__history or on Facebook at Unsung History Podcast. To contact us with questions, corrections, praise, or episode suggestions, please email kelly@unsunghistorypodcast.com. If you enjoyed this podcast, please rate, review, and tell everyone you know. Bye!
MSW